Greetings and welcome to another edition of Montpelier Connection. I'm State Representative Mike Mrowicki from the Windham-4 District of Putney, Dummerston, Westminster, and today I'm proud and pleased to have my district mate and the Dean of the House, Representative David Deen.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me. Thanks for doing this also.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be able to share our work with our constituents, and we are in the aftermath of the 2016 session. Actually, we're not quite done yet, it seems like. We have.
This is the day before the veto session.
We have something to deal with, and hopefully it won't turn into anything bigger than it already is. Looking back, though, on the 2016 session, we all had some ideas on what we had hoped to get done. Sometimes things carry over from 2015 to 16. And what's it feel like to you from looking at what you hope to get done in January to how we finished up in May?
Well, our major focus, and by our, I mean the Fish, Wildlife, and Water Resources Committee, which is my main committee responsibility in the House, were following up on the Clean Water Act, which passed last session in 2015. And we needed to do some tweaks. It was a very large, very complex piece of legislation, and when people do anything, you don't get it all right, even though you intended to get it right. So we needed to do some tweaks here and there on that piece of legislation. We also, because implementation began July 1, 2015, wanted to find out how the process was moving forward. Were we making progress? We had put aside additional funds that were going to bring on some additional people that would focus strictly on the water quality issues that municipalities and farms faced. And we wanted to know from those two agencies, the Agriculture, Food Markets, and the Agency of Natural Resources, whether they were hiring, training, putting in place the necessary regulatory structure to be able to do what the Act instructed them to do. We were reasonably pleased in terms of the number of tweaks that were necessary were few, they were minor, and we had to extend a date in order for agriculture to meet their requirement to publish new acceptable agricultural practices. And we had to extend it from July 1 to October 1, Yeah. It was changes like that, so not significant at all. That bill was such a large effort that this year we didn't have a large agenda in our committee. And in terms of the Clean Water Act, that started in 2011. Mm-hmm. That started in water year 2011. When the people of Vermont were faced with Tropical Storm Irene, which people over on this side of the state certainly remember, but most people over here don't remember what May 2011 was about in terms of Lake Champlain. The highest level ever recorded in terms of the level of Lake Champlain occurred in the third week of May in 2011. Flooding, washouts, all of the stuff that occurred here. And those people that live in Brattleboro certainly remember the Whetstone Brook taking out the southern end of Main Street. The same thing happened along the shores of Lake Champlain. That began some thoughtful review of a lot of issues. In particular, in terms of Lake Champlain, with all of that sediment and all of that heavy water and all the runoff from the land getting in there, subsequent years, 2, 3, 4 years later, they had the largest blooms of cyanobacteria that the lake has had in forever. And cyanobacteria is toxic to humans and animals and pets, and it doesn't smell very good, and it kills fish. And when fish die in numbers, wash up on the shores. They don't smell very good. And one of the effects of that water year 2011 in Lake Champlain was property devaluation in 2015 along the shores of the lake. And through that whole period of time, the momentum was building. Okay, we're going to get serious about nutrient runoff, toxic pollution to Lake Champlain and get this under control. That said, we are Connecticut River representatives, and being able to use water year 2011, both in terms of Tropical Storm Irene and high water in Lake Champlain, we were able to create a statewide water quality program in both the Agriculture, Food and Markets Agency, the Agency of Natural Resources, the Agency of Conservation and Community Development, and the Vermont Transportation Agency, and started marshaling resources across government to clean water. And it took 2013, 2014, and 2015 to actually pass the bill. In our body, in the House, it involved the Agriculture Committee, the Transportation Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, the Appropriations Committee, the Government Operations Committee, and I'm forgetting one. Oh, did I say Agriculture Committee? And when we went to the floor to be able to bring the bill in its total form to the 150 members of the House, we had to suspend rules because the complexity of the bill demanded that more committees than normally report a bill be part of the report in terms of the work they did. Very complex piece of legislation, involved for the first time focused resources on water quality across state government, from the general fund to the transportation fund, and anything we could find in between, but it passed. And as I've already said, this year we were prepared to do what was necessary to sort of twist the dials a little bit to make sure we had gotten it right. There wasn't that much that we had gotten wrong, which is one of the strengths of the broad number of committees. Most committees have 11 members on them. I believe I mentioned 5. You know, that's 50 members of the House, all that have eyes on what's in front of the House. And there were changes throughout the process, but none changed the intent of the bill to clean up the waters of all of the state of Vermont.
Yeah. Now, you make a good point there. I've heard from people locally who have the misconception that this is only for Lake Champlain. But here on the eastern border, we have a lot of concerns to be aware of in the Connecticut River. I think phosphorus is the problem in Lake Champlain, but it's a different story here in the Connecticut River.
Nitrogen is the concern here. Yeah. And it's because the Connecticut River is part of the Long Island Sound watershed. It's one of the major contributors of water. Excuse me, some 70% of the fresh water in Long Island Sound comes through the Connecticut River. In salt water, if you have too much nutrient and you get high plant growth, you have the same kinds of problems that you have in Champlain. But in salt water, it's nitrogen. If you overload salt water with nitrogen, that's when you get those big blooms of algae and plant growth and all of the problems associated with that. So what we found as we were developing the Clean Water Act was two things of interest and importance. First off, the techniques that work for phosphorus work for nitrogen, all right? So it's not like you have to have a program approach for this nutrient as opposed to this nutrient. They both can be dealt with. Better roads management, better management of fields and farms, logging operations, and the things that put discharge into the waters of the state. The other thing that was, I guess, wonderfully serendipitous to find out was that the things that were going to help us with clean water were also going to help us with flood resiliency. One of the things we learned during Tropical Storm Irene and the high water events in May of 2011 was that properly sized infrastructure, properly located and developed personal property survive floods. And in the long run, it's less expensive to do it with high water in mind when you conduct that activity. Don't build in floodplains. Don't undersize your culverts. Make sure your bridges have the kind of span necessary to be able to withstand high water events. Unfortunately, again, going back to Brattleboro, sometimes we have development in places where it shouldn't be, and there may not be much that we can do here. Downtown Brattleboro is hard on the shores of the Whetstone Brook. As you get out towards the headwaters, though, you can make some choices there in terms of giving the river access to its floodplain that will help that downtown infrastructure and personal property that's built so close to the Whetstone Brook. It's one of those win-win situations. If you build it right, you help the river, and you aren't going to have to replace it as often.
Yeah. You mentioned one of the other considerations in all this is agriculture. Now, agriculture has been going through some transformation as well. There's a new set of RAPs coming out, required agricultural practices. Does that touch on water?
That is specifically about water, the changes that are coming into place. Where can you stack manure? Not in the floodplain anymore. When can you apply manure? Not when there's going to be high water events and that it's going to get washed into the rivers and into the lake.
Does that extend? Currently, you can't spread manure from, what is it, December to April?
Yeah, December 15 to April 15. We gave agriculture, both the agency and those that are actively farming, some flexibility. All right, but we want them to think about when and how. Frozen ground, high water event coming, don't spread manure.
Yeah.
And one thing I would like to point out, now that you've touched on the required ag practices, they are not finished. Those regulations are not finished. They are still going through review. There are 5 scheduled hearings around the state. There are 2 in our watershed. One is in South Royalton on June 23rd, I believe it is, and one is here in Brattleboro at the American Legion, 12:30 to 3:30 in the afternoon on June 29th.
Yeah.
And so I encourage river users and ag people and town and municipal officials and road foremen and whomever, show up.
That is the place to have your voice heard.
That's where you can have your voice heard beyond talking to you and I at the public policy level. There's an implementation level where things can and do change. And June 29th is the time here in the southeastern area of the state to talk about what should the rules governing agriculture relative to water quality look like, sound like, and be implemented.
Yep. And of course, this is one of those things that we are not just doing for ourselves, because it's going to take a while to clean up the water that has already gotten to that point. We're doing this for the next generation, for subsequent generations. So it's something that it's doing the right thing for the generations to come.
Right, and even though you and I both have that very long-term perspective, the plan that we're operating under is a 20-year plan. So even at the immediate implementation, nuts and bolts on the ground, doing things stage, it's a 20-year plan.
Yeah.
We just can't do it all that quickly. And then the environment will take time to respond to the changes that we've put in place. One of the disheartening things about phosphorus in particular is that it goes into the water column, it gets taken up by the plants as they grow, which is why you get too many plants. They die, the phosphorus returns to the soil at the bottom of the lake, river, stream. Nitrogen, we get a little bit of a break because once you go through that cycle, in fact, some of the nitrogen vaporizes. Most of the air around us is nitrogen, and it in fact rejoins its brethren molecules of nitrogen and does in fact lessen over time more quickly than phosphorus does.
Now, your committee is Fish, Wildlife, and Water Resources. Those other first two subjects are pretty important to a lot of people, especially for the culture of Vermont. Now, going back to Tropical Storm Irene, we had some damage to one of our fish hatcheries and also a lot of the rivers and streams. Yeah. Where are we at now with that?
Well, two responses. One, we're beginning to rebuild that fish hatchery, and money was made available this year to do that. And
this is trout.
Yeah, this is trout, and this is to put brook and brown and rainbow trout into the streams on a stocking basis. We have been negotiating with FEMA, and many municipal officials, any of them looking at this, are going to recognize this syndrome, if you will, to get them to pony up the money. And we've finally worked all that out, and now we are adding in the state dollars to begin that rebuilding process. It'll take, I think, 3 years for it to finish. On the river side, somewhere in Vermont, every year there is flooding. So our fish and wildlife biologists have a pretty good idea of what happens to the level of aquatic organisms in a stream when there's flooding and it's sort of left alone. We, after Irene, because things were so extensive and people were so, there was so much damage to infrastructure and people just, Grafton was completely cut off.
Yeah.
The work that was done in the streams made the problem worse. And where a normal stream left to its own devices will take about 3 years to recover from a big flood event in terms of changing the shape of the stream, washing out all the fish that are in it. We made things worse in over 80 miles of stream by the work that was done by the big yellow machines. And nobody's yelling or calling the guys operating the big yellow machines bad guys. One of the things we did, not in the Clean Water Act, but in a previous piece of legislation, was create a training institute. So people operating machines at the state level, the local level, and at the private level understand how to be stream friendly when you're doing that recovery work. So the normal expectation is that there's a cycle, things will go down, and in about 3 years, natural recovery will occur. Unfortunately, we did some bad things, takes longer, but we're hoping that the next high water event, whether it's localized or whether it's as widespread as the water events of 2011 were, that with better understanding, because most of the people operating those big yellow machines hunt and fish, they want healthy rivers too. They now have the tools, the knowledge to be able to do it in a river-friendly way.
Well, taking a sidestep to some of the other issues we looked at, I think today in the news was the governor signed the budget we put together, with his help. And once again, we're putting forward a balanced budget, as we do every year. Alongside that, one of the things that we've been talking about is this was the first time we didn't use what's called one-time money
Right.
that's been set aside
Yep.
to help balance the budget. And the budget growth is matched to the growth of revenue, which has been a challenge since the Great Recession. But it's something that I think we all take a lot of pride in, is keeping the fiscal house in order. However, there's always things we don't get to do or we'd like to do. Are there things still on the table that you'd like to be doing next year and that we didn't get to this year? Could be in your committee or otherwise.
Yes, I spent some of the time at the end of this past session beginning to build an agenda on toxics. Part of the reason was that the federal government totally abdicated its responsibility in terms of controlling toxics being released into the environment. And if those are just words, think about PFOA going into the water in Bennington and North Bennington, and what's happening and has happened to the people who live there through a chemical that the user did nothing wrong with because it wasn't controlled.
Yeah.
Nobody knew at the time it was being used that it had these negative effects. And part of that is that the Food and Drug Administration doesn't check toxics. EPA is supposed to. They've never had enough money. They've never had the authority. At this point, we've invested some time in terms of building an agenda for Vermont to deal with toxics here in the state. I think we're going to have to spend a fair amount of time getting to understand this new federal legislation in terms of what chemicals will be reviewed. Understand that there's some 84,000 chemicals that are used in commerce in this country. Less than 200 of them have been tested for any toxic effects. So we are anxious to see what happens with the federal legislation. But we are going to continue moving forward. And I know your committee that you serve on has dealt with this issue over the years in particular products, and that we jointly, our committees jointly, dealt with the new registry at the Department of Health of toxics in children's toys. Which
Children have been in an area we've emphasized from the poison and lead in the environment and lead paint to children's clothes. There's also some concerns about things like lead in lipstick, and especially in the younger you are, the worse lead is. But you're right. We're not clear whether they're carcinogens or not, but especially with our children, we don't want to take a chance.
Yeah, you don't want to take a chance. I'll have a piece in the paper shortly about the precautionary principle. If you don't know, don't do it. And that is not been the pattern relative to using chemicals in commerce in the country. If it's a chemical made in a lab, I guess everybody just thinks it's wonderful. Well, you know, even Mother Nature makes some chemicals that aren't so good for humans. We're capable of doing that too.
And similarly, just with prescription medicines, there's been a sort of a cultural norm that, let's say you don't need a medicine anymore, or there's a surplus of it, or you're trying to clean up after a relative who's passed on. The cultural norm has been flush it down the toilet. Bad
Please
thing to do.
don't.
No, we've set up, like right here in this building, there's a container where you can bring, outside the police station, where you can bring unused or extra prescription drugs. You can look online to find a way to do it, but it's not a healthy way to do things.
Yeah, not flushing it. The problem is that our wastewater treatment facilities cannot take those chemicals out of the effluent of water that goes as part of the discharge, so that whatever does go down the drain, down the toilet, will make it to the river. And for those of you living in truly rural areas who have septic systems, when you have your septic system pumped, that waste goes to a wastewater treatment facility. And given that it's 3 to 5 years between pumpings, that's what is recommended by the engineers that design these systems, you've got 3 to 5 years concentration of anything you have put down the toilet that is making its way into that wastewater treatment facility. So it's a caution. I'm glad you mentioned the collection things. That was a change my committee made, I can't remember how long ago, 7, 8 years, even before all the collection programs were in place. Under Vermont statute, a local police department or pharmacy or wherever couldn't have those collection bins. We had to change it. And we said, yes, you can collect opiates of this kind once the federal government allows for it. And as soon as they changed their law, then Vermont was in position to be able to begin the collection.
Well, we've only got a few minutes left. We're starting to look ahead. We've got an election year coming up. We're both running for re-election, and I just wanted to share for a minute how pleased I am. Crafting legislation is a skill, a little bit of an art, and takes the right mindset, the right social skills, and I think there are those who think there's nothing to it. But I would counter that experience like yours is invaluable. It's not like, let's say you were going to go get your car fixed. You wouldn't take your car to get fixed from somebody who has never worked on a car before but thinks they have some good ideas. I think similarly with legislation, experience makes all the difference in the world, and it's been a pleasure to work with you. Looking ahead, I know one of the things that you've been real concerned about is that the law that we passed this session gets implemented as it should next session and on into the future. As I said, this is something we're doing for subsequent generations. How does that look like to you? What do you think you're going to need to be doing to provide oversight on that? And are there other things that you're also looking forward to tackling?
No, really the main agenda item that I have is toxics, and to make sure that Vermont is in position to take advantage of any provisions in the new federal law. As we've just mentioned, at one point Vermont law would not have allowed for collection of drugs, even though the feds did allow it. To make sure that there aren't those kinds of conflicts between federal and state law, and clean up anything that's necessary to do. One thing that you've mentioned, sort of, I guess I'll agree, it's the art of legislation. It's hard work to get the right words on paper, but then, as I mentioned earlier in terms of the Clean Water Act, 6 committees on the House side, with at least 60 people that have to understand those words on the paper. If you write them, you probably understand them pretty good. But it doesn't mean that 59 other legislators are going to understand that. If they don't, they might not vote for it. You're successful in the House. You work with 60 people, and we had a very strong, it was nearly unanimous vote on the bill. Goes over to the Senate. They have 4 committees that have to work their way through that, and their primary source of information for a House-originated bill are the House members who passed it and worked on the bill. So you've got to be able to maintain communications in the other body. Meanwhile, while the work in the House and the work in the Senate that you're now helping out with, you have to be working with the administration. Because what you end up with, if you don't work with the administration, and sometimes even when you do work with the administration, is a veto.
Yeah.
And that's when we started the program we're talking about. We're headed up there to deal with 2 vetoes
Yeah.
tomorrow.
Yep.
So it, that's, you have to understand how the process works. You have to be able to write the law, and we have attorneys at Ledge Council that help us do that. But then you have to work within the process and gain understanding of what you're trying to do.
Well, I don't know anyone that does it any better than you, David, so it's a pleasure to watch you do it and to have that sense of the big picture and then bringing it down to ground level.
Right. Well, and I know that groups of your peers have congratulated you for your caring in terms and ability in terms of after-school programs, and became part of a national award process. And so you're not so bad yourself, fella.
Well, it's a good team here,
Yeah.
so I appreciate working together with you. And I appreciate as well working together with the people here at BCTV, part of that community television network across the state that brings our work closer to you, that brings communities closer together, especially for those for whom getting out and around is not that easy. So thanks to the people here. And hopefully we'll be talking to you again soon. But until next time, this is Mike Mrowicki. Bye-bye now.